Really excited for this afternoon's panel. We have a stellar cast, and we're going to be talking about how startups and governments are able to collaborate together. As we know that oftentimes when we talk about GovTech, it's the big traditional established players, and for good reason. Oftentimes it takes huge policy teams that's able to go through the pages and pages of paperwork, policy, regulations that it takes to collaborate with governments. But unfortunately, it's oftentimes the startups who have the most innovative ideas. They have the most creative ideas. And so how are you able to break those barriers? So today we're going to figure out how can we cut that red tape and find a way that we can bring these two ecosystems together to really unlock the power of collaboration. So Ate, perhaps I'd start with you. You are the president of Sitra. It's a very unique organization that was established by the Finnish parliament nearly 60 years ago. So I'm wondering if you can share how Sitra has remained to stay so relevant in today's context, to reinvent itself, and perhaps germane to today's discussion, how it works to bridge the gap between governments and startups.
Well, I think those who founded Sitra a long time ago had a great idea that Sitra should be a flexible, kind of most flexible part of the public sector and public sector, especially in its renewal. So in our history, we have also, Sitra has renewed itself several times. We have been a major capital investor in Finland. We have been a think tank. We are now, we call ourselves a kind of a future house or future fund. And our role is very unique in the world because we are not only a think tank, but we also are doing projects and financing projects. So we first try to understand where the world is going at, and we had a nice presentation just about the challenges, and there is no scarcity of major challenges. But then we gather different actors of the society together and try to find a kind of at least some sort of common understanding of how we should change our behavior so that the future would be better. And then we help that process to start with funding and expertise. So about half of our kind of impact comes from funding, and half of it comes from experts that work for Sitra. And we have been very different animal in the previous years, but this is how we work today.
So really helping to tackle the challenges along the value chain, so not just at the beginning or at the end, but really trying to map these things together. Manuel, perhaps I'd turn to you. You are both an entrepreneur yourself, having founded a very successful GovTech startup in Germany, and now you sit on the other side of the table as the global managing director for the Global GovTech Center in Berlin. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, having both hats, how can governments better support GovTech startups and instead of just relying on some of the big players?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly, for the question. So I have a very clear opinion on this, and that is public procurement. I think there was a big misconceptions at governments for the last couple of years that said the prime channel through which they interacted with startups was subsidies or R&D grants. You know, and this helps startups, obviously, but that volume of those funds is limited. And eventually, I, as a founder, of course, I want to sell a product. I want to get revenues, you know. And revenues from government clients mean public procurement. And I believe that, yeah, the prime interaction should go through public procurement. There's incountable startups out there, GovTech startups out there that have great, very fitting technological solutions for governments. And we have to use the power of public procurement to get those into government. I think it also has a distinct, like I would say, a distinct quality for startups to get government clients instead of subsidies. Because look, if I, as a former founder, would look at my bank account and say, I've got $1 of subsidy on my bank account, or I've got $1 of revenue, I would always use the $1 of revenue because it comes with a different quality. You know, it comes with the quality that someone else trusted in my product, yeah, gave me money for me to delivering the product. That is a strong testament, a strong signal for be it investors or be it other clients that my product as a startup is working and that I can further scale my business. So yeah, this is done through public procurement, and this is why I think this is sort of the sleeping giant that we haven't really looked at it. but that's really important. And also, just if you look at the volume, you know, global public procurement, I think, stands at $13 trillion per year. Let's just say it would be 10 trillion. That's easier to calculate. If we just had 1% of this channeled towards startups, you know, that's $100 billion per year. Sum it up for 5 years, 500 billion US dollar, and that 500 sounds very similar, very familiar to the Stargate project, you know, that US President Donald Trump mentioned 2 weeks ago. So we sort of, just by shifting public procurement a little bit, would have globally an instrument at the same size of Stargate, and could really use this to push tech ahead, to push startups ahead, and to modernize governments at the same time. And I think we absolutely have to use this chance to make that work.
So one of the key red tapes, procurement, and figuring out how to navigate and unlock that capital. So speaking of capital, Lulu, you run a very successful podcast and also a VC firm, and you talk to hundreds, maybe thousands of startups, and you've heard their stories in terms of what leads to success and what leads to failure. So in your experience in all those conversations, I'm wondering if you can share some of the biggest challenges that startups face, and what are the key factors that ultimately make the ones who are successful a success?
So if we're talking about the government sector specifically, I think we need to look at 3 things mainly. Initially, if we look at the funnel itself, the number of startups that are working, that are in GovTech is very, very small. So actually, there's a think tank here called Clear World. They've done a study on the sector, and basically they said only 4% of VC funds here in the region actually have invested in anything to do with GovTech. So it's literally at the bottom of the list when it comes to investments. So the investments are not there. Therefore, the founders are not really incentivized to go into this sector. And even from those who go into this sector, only 4 out of 10 startups can get funding, access to funding. So even if they do venture and go into this sector, 6 out of 10 will probably not get funding and eventually die. It's 12 times harder to get access to funds for a GovTech startup than it is for an AI startup. So I think we really need to address the issues around the funnel and make sure that founders are incentivized to go into this sector to begin with, and that VCs are actually funding startups in this sector. The second challenge is obviously procurement, which is what Manuel said. It's a huge challenge. You know, startups are often competing with, you know, the Oracles, the Microsofts, the SAPs of the world, which is extremely challenging. The RFP process takes a very long time. Sometimes companies are required to have, let's say, 3 years of operations or 5 years of operations and audited statements, and all of that is very difficult for startups. Payment terms are obviously very challenging. You're talking 90 days, 60 days, sometimes 90 days, which is obviously, again, it doesn't work for a startup from a cash flow standpoint, so that's also a very, very big challenge. And the last is the data privacy requirements. So all governments will require on-premises data management and servicing, and that obviously is a big investment on the behalf of startups. And that's a roadblock, because a lot of the investment, I mean, from the little investment that goes into this sector, the startups would need it for operations and not to invest in CapEx to basically cater for what the government needs. So there's quite a few challenges around that when it comes to this sector specifically.
So it's not a lack of good ideas, it's really the structural imperatives and also the incentives that actually are driving those good ideas to then try to make that leap.
Yeah.
So Ahmed, maybe I'll turn to you. So Hub 71 has cultivated a really strong ecosystem for startups. What would you see as some of the biggest barriers from where you sit in Abu Dhabi, and how is Hub 71 helping to overcome some of those barriers that Lulu mentioned as well?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I mean, I agree with what my peers do say. Procurement is a critical part of the journey. But if I go back, maybe it's a bit of a contrarian view here. It's always the question is whether a government should work with a startup in the first place, because not all government departments necessarily need to rely on startup solutions. That ultimately there are, either taxpayers or like there are public infrastructure that needs to be developed or public solutions that maybe a startup isn't always ready to bear that responsibility. That being said, in Abu Dhabi specifically and historically, the government has been the largest spender. So there is a huge piece of the pie that startups need to tap into and can tap into, because there are a lot of, let's say, more on the software side that startups should be applying it to. Governments historically were more accustomed to brand names, so they're like, more familiar, easier for, I go through this journey, it's easier for shareholder, stakeholder approval. So to create a path, it's not only ensuring that it's always multilingual, if I would say, because one, they do speak, startups and government departments speak different languages. Our role as an enabler is to make sure, one, primarily the startup is ready to engage with that government or that department, ensure it's able to meet its objective and needs and not be overwhelmed by it, and at the same time ensure that the government departments are ready to engage with innovative ideas. Not all government departments, at least from what I see, are, but some of them are very progressive. They tend to be, even an example is defense industries, for example, innovation fuels a lot of what happens there, security reasons, etc. Other departments, maybe more on the infrastructure side, you need solutions that ensure minimum, almost 100% accuracy and compliance. So I'd say Hub 71's role is twofold, is to make sure that the department should take this, should work more closely with startups and is ready to engage with them. And on the startup side, it's ready to present a solution in a way that the department can digest it.
So understand what the use case is, that startups are not right for all systems, but also speaking the same language is critically important. So Atiya, I turn back to you. So if we could take a step back, and of course with governments we're dealing with legacy systems, we're dealing with political cycles, we're dealing with procurement issues. If we could design an ideal model, or we could start from scratch in terms of thinking about what would be the best way for governments and startups to collaborate, what would be some of the core tenets of this model that you think that government should keep in mind?
Well, I think what was just said in the panel about the problems, there are reasons for that. I think it's extremely difficult for government to buy in a procurement from a startup, because startup, by definition, is a very small thing. It's in its beginning. If you try to change the whole society, do you trust in a startup that has an idea that has not yet been proven? So I think the system, the government or the whatever the body is, in our case, it's the country and the government should have a kind of a strategic view on this issue, meaning that developing small companies that can grow to the size in which they can both serve national needs but also grow to international markets. Let's take, for example, healthcare. We are now participating in a government program in which we try to promote practices in Finland where the Finnish healthcare system creates a kind of environment where startups can thrive and grow, and the best cases then becomes kind of bigger companies, growth companies, with the aim that they become exporting companies and their solutions can be exported. So yes, we need ideas. For ideas, we need university and business and perhaps government collaboration. Then we need capital, but we need this strategic path towards growth, because no government can run its services with startups. They have to be much, much bigger. They have to be 100 times, 1,000 times bigger in the phase where they really are responsible for core government services.
So taking in mind the scale and also finding, again, maybe the use cases, the edge cases where we can experiment, we can sandbox, where we can allow the sort of small scale not to be an inhibitor of what the creative idea.
In Finland, for example, we have more than 20 healthcare districts or regions. They make decisions by themselves. What if they would choose a couple of solutions and the best ones would be the ones that win the game, and then the others would kind of had decided that they will choose the ones that prove to be the best ones. And then the market is huge. And then that company can become a strong player also in international markets. For governments, of course, the governments have different environments, so it's difficult to scale internationally. But in healthcare, it's a little bit easier because humans have similar problems.
Thank you, Ate. Lulu, maybe from the inverse perspective, what do you think startups need to do differently, aside from be able to grow and find money and some of the structural problems that are not fully in their control? But what advice would you give startups for them to be able to work more seamlessly with governments for those who do want to enter the space?
I think I echo what Ahmed said is know your customer. You know, I think it's very important for startups and government to speak the same language. I think for a startup founder to want to work with government, they need to probably have worked in government or really understand how government works. I think that's very important to understand the pain points and also to have the network and the access to have a seat on the table, to have a discussion. So I think that's pretty crucial. I think at some point they'll need to consider obviously having the on-premises services in order to be able to support or to work with government on certain projects. And I think that's important. And maybe another way in, so there's in the UAE, for example, there was a very successful program called the Dubai Future Accelerator, where basically they got startups from all over the world to sit directly with various government entities to work on problems together. So there was some kind of co-creation process basically happening. So I think these programs like that are very important, or potentially the other path is to partner with some of the bigger companies that are already working with government, and maybe the route to government is through an Oracle or through another maybe bigger player. So I think partnerships also could play a big role, or potentially if there are any of these innovative procurement type programs, I think that's also a very good route in.
Manuel, maybe building on some of Lulu's ideas, can you share outside of procurement what advice you give to governments for those who want to engage more with startups? And do you have any examples you might be able to share of additional success cases where this in fact has worked?
Yeah, I think for governments it's essential to sort of uncover the problems they want to solve. You know, because oftentimes I see that the solution and the path is very clear, especially when it comes to creating tech, but then the underlying problem is not so clear. And it goes back a little bit to the discussions we had this morning about user centricity and so forth, you know? So I think for governments to really understand what's the kind of problem that I want to solve, that creates the openness to also look at new technological solutions provided by, can be a startup, can be an SME, or can be big tech. But I think having this openness and having a really a good understanding of what's the problem that I want to solve, and to understand, is this mission critical, for example? Or is this less critical, where I could also take the chance of working together with a startup? I think this is advice I would like to give to governments, to be really open about this. And from the perspective of citizens, I would also I would demand this from governments always, and also, you know, because at the end of the day, we talk about public procurement, it's taxpayers' money, you know. So I would have the ambition for every government to spend this in the best possible way. And to do this, I think that requires a really good understanding of, yeah, as I said, what's the problem I want to solve, what's out there in the market to help me solving this, and then going for the best possible solution. And that's always going to be, I think, a mix between how good's the solution at solving the problem, how secure is it, how fast is it, and so forth. And depending on the context of the problem, that's going to look different for every instance. But this is sort of the playbook I would like to give to governments for engaging with tech in general.
So taking it back to the basics, getting really clear about what your problem statement is, and then figuring out the fundamentals while keeping in mind the ultimate accountability of the taxpayers or the citizens. So Ahmed, maybe I'd like to turn towards you for more of a local context. So here in the UAE, they've made incredible efforts to become a really innovation-friendly destination, and they've attracted talent and startup from all over the world. For the GovTech startups sitting here in the room, or maybe those of you who are streaming at home, what message would you like to deliver to them about the UAE?
And I'm glad actually Lulu mentioned the Dubai Future Accelerator, because it's initiatives like these, it's initiatives like Shara in Sharjah, like Hub 71 in Abu Dhabi, that are fortifying the UAE's efforts to enable any startup to work closely with the local ecosystem, with government departments, with government-backed companies such as G42 or Mubadala, or who are today more innovation-driven than ever. The message is the UAE is open for business. This is a great startup destination. The ease of doing business here is, if you don't know it, please, I do encourage you to come know it. I would say it is unparalleled. And we do draw a lot of inspiration from our peers at Finland. Huge fan of what happens at Slush, even at Berlin, visited a few times. And we'd like to keep up with what's happening in the world.
So the UAE is open for business, open for startups, open for collaboration. Well, we just have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask each of you to very quickly, we want to end on a note of optimism. There's a lot of geopolitical tensions happening out in the world. There's a lot of new leaders in place, a lot of elections happening, a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of opportunities for new strategic priorities. On the technology front, of course, AI is everywhere, and there's lots of exciting possibility, but then, of course, we must think about the ethics and cybersecurity among many other challenges. So as you think about 2025, what is one word or one line, perhaps, that we could leave the audience with to be optimistic about when we think about GovTech and governments? Perhaps I'd start with you.
It's all about impact. It's all about solving the same human problems through technology.
Lulu?
I think we live in a great region where so much is happening. I literally think this region is going to be the center of the world.
Manuel?
Every single GovTech founder that I know is intrinsically motivated to make the world a better place, to make government a better place. And I think government needs to use this intrinsic motivation, and it's all up there, so we just have to do it.
Ate, we'll give you the last word.
Well, the problems are so huge that the people working in present government organizations are not able to solve them. New ideas are desperately needed.
Well, 25 minutes goes fast, and this has been an excellent discussion. So thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation. Thank you.